Okay, I believe we are live. So welcome everyone to the continued Summer of Protocols guest talk series. Today we have Mike Masnick with us, and our next talk, I believe, is scheduled for tomorrow. So you can catch Brian Johnson as part of this series as well tomorrow. Um, Venkat, do you want to give a quick intro to Mike before we get started?
Yeah. So early in the program, we posted Mike's platforms versus protocols piece, and he just had a profile in the New York Times a couple of days ago. So if you want to get caught up on who he is, you should read that. Many of you may not be aware since he's been around so long. He's kind of part of the infrastructure, so it's easy to forget. So TechDirt has been around since 1998, right? So
Yeah.
it's uh, witnessed, I think, I would say three cycles of tech booms and busts. So Web 1, Web 2, and now Web 3 protocols era. And it's one of those kind of sources that's steadily been there covering tech. And lately, Mike's been on Blue Sky as well, with occasional ranting on the ongoing platform and protocol wars. And I'd known of Mike through reputation before, but I only got introduced to him recently from one of our earlier guest speakers, Rene. So yeah, we got to Mike via Rene DeRestia, who spoke, I think, a month or so ago. And I think continuing along the same note, actually, so protocols kind of in the public sphere in the context of like the larger tech conversation and stuff. So excited to hear from you, Mike. Take it away.
Great. Thank you. I am excited to do this. So I do have a little presentation that I'll go through, and then I'm hoping we'll have plenty of time for question and answer at the end. Let me figure out how to pull up this, get the screen sharing for the presentation. So give me 1 second. Screen share. And okay. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
Yes. Okay. Cool. So first of all, thank you guys so much for having me. It's I've been looking forward to this. I um, uh, apologize. I was supposed to do it a couple of weeks ago, and I got caught in sort of travel hell. It was kind of a mess, and so I appreciate everybody being able to reschedule the this discussion. Um, the what I'm hoping to do today is kind of talk about kind of where my thinking has been regarding all of the protocols and also decentralization, because it's kind of adjusted over time, and I don't think the ideas are crystallized in my head right now, and so I was actually really hoping that I could sort of share where my brain is at, and then hear from everyone here who's been thinking about protocols obviously quite a lot across this program, and just sort of stress test where my thinking is right now, and get a sense of where things are going. So as Venkat said, I'm Mike Masnick. I run the site TechDirt, which has been around for 25 years, and the Kopi Institute, which is sort of a think tank that does events and papers, and lately games, just trying to help people understand various complex subjects. So, what I want to talk about today, if I can actually advance my slides, which is not happening, which is always fun. Um, give me 1 second. Why is this not advancing? That's always fun. There we go. Oh, I'm starting to move things. All right. So again, the discussion, I want to start with kind of how I came to the thoughts about protocols, not platforms, and kind of where I was thinking on all of these things, and then what my latest thinking is, and kind of where I think some of the interesting opportunities are, but also some of the interesting challenges. Um, a lot of people know about the Protocols Not Platforms paper, which Venkat mentioned was shared. My thinking on that actually started even earlier than that. This is actually a 2015 article that I wrote on TechDirt, which was at a point when there was a lot of really widespread discussion, particularly about both Twitter and Reddit, and sort of how they were coming to an understanding of what content moderation, trust and safety actually meant, and as they were figuring out how to handle some of the big challenges, and they were getting criticized widely. And the idea that I came to was, why were we having this discussion now? This is again in sort of 2015, as opposed to earlier eras of the internet. As Venkat said, I've been around forever. I'm old. I had seen earlier discussions, and I remembered things like, Usenet and other like even pre-web places, and I was trying to understand why things were different, and I began to realize, like, the main difference between a Usenet era and a Reddit era, for example, was that Usenet was decentralized based on a protocol rather than centralized, where there was one party in control. So I sort of began to think about these ideas and what was going on, and eventually that led to the more well-known paper, The Protocols Not Platform. This was the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. Somebody there had seen some of the TechDirt blog posts I'd written kind of discussing this idea, following on that 2015 one, and sort of pushing people to think about these things. And so it really got me to solidify my thinking. In particular, it really sort of stress tested some of the ideas that I had. It was mostly really written in 2018. It came out in 2019. But I would say the editor of this paper did not agree with the ideas in the paper, which was actually really useful in terms of saying, like, wait, how does this make sense? What would happen in these kind of scenarios? So I really tried to put all of my, all of the detail and all of the pros and cons into that paper, and try and, really, go through it in pretty great detail. And that paper has certainly caught on in a lot of ways, and I hear about it all the time. People have quoted it, people have used it. A lot of people have said that work that they've done has sort of been inspired by it, which is very nice and flattering. But there have been a couple of things that have come up that have concerned me about that, about the way that people have read the paper, and also some of the criticisms of the paper that I thought were really worth engaging with, that I thought were really sort of interesting and valuable criticisms about it. And that sort of helped evolve some of my thinking over the last few years. But the paper, if you haven't read it, sort of the key takeaways in Protocols Not Platforms is this idea of, it's really useful and powerful to push the power to the edges away from the center. A lot of the challenges and difficulties I think we've seen with the modern web is that, this buildup of very, very large centralized players that would silo information, and the people, the actual users, were losing control, losing transparency into what is happening with their information, and that created a whole bunch of follow-on problems, not the least of which were some of the challenges around content moderation, but also questions around privacy. Excuse me. And I thought that, switching to this protocol-based, more decentralized system, pushing power to the edges, giving people a lot more control, giving people a lot more transparency into what was happening, would be useful in sort of creating a different setup for many of those challenges. But also I thought that it would create increasing competition rather than sort of, relying on just a few giant centralized players. And so, oops, what is going on? This is not supposed to be blank. I'm actually wondering if that's the wrong slide. I realize I'm in the wrong slides. So I'm going to stop for a second and switch to the right slides. That was weird. Well, that's slightly embarrassing. Hold on. Why is this doing that now? Let me get to the right slides. I had a half a presentation and then I went to the wrong one. All right. Hold on. Okay. All right. There we go. All right, let me share screen again. Sorry about that. I feel like this talk is constantly cursed. All right. Share the screen. Okay, can people see that again? Okay, I got thumbs up. Yes. Okay, cool. Sorry about that. All right, so we are in a different presentation that looks the same because now I'm in the right presentation. All right, so what I was saying was that one of the keys in this paper was this idea of decentralization and understanding the role of decentralization, and that became sort of a point of a talking point that I kept hearing, was decentralization, and I agree with that. I thought the decentralization aspect was the key, and that if we could figure out better ways to decentralize all of these systems that we were using, it wouldn't solve all problems, but it would create better incentives and a better structure overall that we could do things with. And then I started to go through some of the competition, not competition, the criticisms and concerns that people had, and some of them I think were actually really interesting and worth engaging with and thinking about. So I'm going to go through sort of 3 criticisms that came up related to the paper that really got me thinking about it. I still believe in the sort of core fundamental principles, but I think I may have missed some interesting aspects that I'm thinking about these days. And so the first criticism that came up was that working on protocols is too slow. And Moxie Marlinspike, who I'm sure people are familiar with, is the guy behind Signal and a variety of other things. He wrote this blog post about 5 or 6 years ago called "The Ecosystem is Moving," and he argued that focusing on protocols and things like federation just is too slow in a sort of rapidly moving environment. So said that once you federate your protocol, it becomes very difficult to make changes, and right now at the application level, things that stand still don't fare very well in a world where the ecosystem is moving. Was sort of the larger point that he was saying, if you're in a rapidly changing environment, a protocol and focusing on a protocol is too slow, and it can't adapt, and you can't innovate fast enough. The second criticism also comes from Moxie and is in that same article, which is basically that, and in some ways these things are probably related, that not only is it too slow, a protocol-based system is really open to capture. That you can have someone come in and sort of take over the protocol and build a kind of proprietary, locked up, centralized version of it and be successful. So he gives examples of Slack and IRC, Facebook with email, which I'm not exactly sure is entirely accurate, and then WhatsApp and XMPP. But interesting challenge. And this was definitely something that I had talked a little bit about in the paper, but a lot of people raised this idea of if you were to build a sort of protocolized social media system, what happens, and which turns out to be very interesting these days. What happens when a Facebook, for example, comes in and just sort of sucks up all of the data in the protocol, creates its own version of it, and then just becomes the de facto controller of it, and the rest of it is is sort of effectively wiped out. It's kind of a embrace, extend, extinguish kind of model. And Moxie was certainly worried about that, and a lot of people have raised that over time as well. Now, the last one, the last criticism that I got, which is not a Moxie one, but really one that comes from anyone, not anyone, but maybe 90% of the people who try Mastodon for the first time and are trying to understand it as sort of a Twitter alternative, which is basically it's a little confusing, it's a little complex. The centralized systems just work and they're simple and they make sense. So people kept telling me, well, the problem with the whole protocols over platforms idea is that it's too complicated. Nobody's going to figure it out. You're requiring people to do too much to actually understand what they're doing. And I think there are responses to each of these criticisms, but I think that they're all sort of things that need to be taken seriously and need to be dealt with, because you can't ignore them, because they are all things that are real. Then the other thing that came out of the paper that I thought was interesting and has driven some of my thinking were interpretations of the paper that I think were wrong. I think people got confused by the paper and started saying stuff back to me that they claim the paper supported that I don't think it does, and I think actually created really weird thinking on the paper. And so the first one was that if you had a system of protocols, it meant that because the discussion came out of like content moderation questions on the internet, that if you had protocols that you could do no more content moderation, you didn't have to think about trust and safety issues or anything like that. And as I say here, that sort of is a recipe for creating sort of cesspool websites. You have just at a starting point, you have legal issues, child sexual abuse material. If it's on your system, you're going to be in a world of trouble from law enforcement. Copyright infringement, there are certain legal requirements around that. And then just in general, a system that has no moderation at all has to deal with harassment, abuse, things that tend to actually drive away a lot of users and make and make other things, like if there's any kind of business model, if you have advertising, it makes it a lot more difficult to actually do those things. So, but I heard from a lot of people that, if you just had a system of protocols, then you've solved the content moderation problem. That's not true. I think there are ways that it creates much better incentives in terms of how you structure things, but it doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't mean that you can ignore the question of how you moderate a platform or any particular system within that. The second area of confusion was that you could just build a protocol and people will come and use it. And in the 2 years or so after I wrote the Protocols Not Platform paper, the thing I heard way too often was somebody would read the paper and then contact me and say, I built it. I built what you have in your paper. And they would show me some sort of, protocol that they had come up with, and I would say, how many people are using it? And, the answer would always be somewhere in the range of, 10 to 100 people, maybe. Just building a protocol is not enough. And what was funny to me also was that everyone who would say that to me would have built some aspect of it, but never had like a complete vision of what the protocol was, or sort of how it was actually going to be used, or how it was going to build up a user base or do something useful, or get people to build on top of it. There was just a lot of build it and they will come kind of thinking to it that that kind of bothered me a little bit, because I was like, if I'm inspiring people to build something that nobody's actually using, something is wrong. And so I wanted to think more deeply about that. And one of the things that came to me was, I kept talking about how the most important part of understanding that paper was understanding the value of decentralization, and and thinking, how do we push power out to the edges, and how do we decentralize it? But after I started thinking about all the criticism and seeing some of the confusion about the paper, I began to question that and began to think, like, was the key really decentralization, or am I missing something else that was in the that was really important in terms of what was the value of using protocols over more centralized platforms? And so eventually, the more I thought about it, I thought the key was not specifically just thinking, oh, decentralization solves everything. The key was somewhat different. It was recognizing within a protocolized based system, one that has decentralization, is which things in that system do you need to centralize and which things do you need to decentralize. And the idea being that, there are some elements of centralization that are actually pretty valuable and pretty useful. There are reasons why we have massively centralized platforms today, and why they sort of took over the internet over the last 20 years. And a lot of that is that you have the efficiency, you have things that are standardized that people figure out how to use, that are just sort of easy to use, which gets at that, the complaint that people had that sort of a protocolized, decentralized system were just too complicated. So that brings me to sort of where I am thinking today around, like, how do we handle which parts should be centralized and which parts should be decentralized? And it resulted in an essay that I wrote earlier this year for the Filecoin Foundation for the Decentralized Web, which was named Decentralization and All the Things, which is perhaps not the greatest title for a piece where I'm talking about, like, which things do you decentralize and which things do you centralize, because it's really not all the things, was kind of the point. This paper, by the way, is part of a larger collection that Filecoin Foundation for the Decentralized Web is putting out as a magazine that I helped to edit. I forget exactly how many pieces we have in there. This is one, but there's another maybe 12 pieces in there. I believe that Filecoin Foundation is putting out that collection as a magazine this week. It's possible. I'm not exactly sure when. I had gotten an email about when it was coming out, and I think it was this week, and I'm forgetting. There are a lot of really, really interesting pieces. So I'm going to recommend. I think everyone here will really enjoy it. Some of the other thinking in there is really great. In particular, there's a piece in there by Danny O'Brien, who works for the Filecoin Foundation, which really, I think, is a really powerful piece in thinking about what is the overall goal, what is the value in terms of pushing for decentralization. And he makes a really strong argument in there that decentralization for the sake of decentralization doesn't make any sense. But understanding what value you have, and he talks about sort of the terminal value of, like, freedom of your mind, is why decentralization is really powerful. And it's a really, really good essay, and really thoughtful, and definitely has helped shape a lot of my thinking on this as well. There are other pieces in there as well. I think it's coming out sometime this week. If not, it'll be very, very soon, and should be really interesting. But the argument that I was making in this piece was that, could we build a framework around which things make sense to be decentralized and which things make sense to be centralized, looking at the sort of advantages of both, and then where does that fit into a kind of protocolized world? And so one of the things that happened as I was thinking about this question of, the sort of push and pull of central versus decentralized systems was, you know, again, sort of like weighing the pros and cons of each. When you have the centralized system, you have the efficiency, you have standardization, you have things that can be widely understood, and that's valuable if you actually want to get users. Whereas the decentralization, obviously, you get more control for the end users, you can create more competition, you create different incentive structures that I think are much more powerful, and sort of, can you balance these two things and sort of take the best of each of them. And at this time, this is probably about a year or so ago, I ended up reading completely randomly, and this has happened a few times before when I'm sort of like thinking through challenging questions like this, how does the world work kind of things. I will read some sort of random book that I'll pick up, almost entirely at random, and it's totally changes my thinking on a whole bunch of things. And so in this case, I started reading this book, and I'm actually forgetting the title of the book, and I should have put it in the presentation. I forgot it. But it was a book about the origin of the interstate highway system. And it's absolutely fascinating. I had no idea the story behind the interstate highway system in the US, and basically how there was like this 50-year fight over whether or not we should build an interstate highway system, who was going to pay for it, how it was going to be set up. And then, finally in the 1950s, it came together and the US started building an interstate highway system. And I began to sort of think about, how that worked. And one of the things in the book that it pointed out was for every dollar that the US spent on building the interstate highway system, within a very short period of time, it got $6 back in terms of economic activity that was generated by the highway system. It opened up all sorts of things that were impossible in the US in particular before that, in terms of, shipping, in terms of things that grew up around the interstate highway system, in terms of retail and travel, and concepts like suburbs and a whole bunch of other things that really sort of were built up around that. And so as I was thinking about that, I sort of began to realize, the highway is kind of a protocol. It's not exactly a perfect analogy, but if I was trying to think about things, if we think of the highway as kind of a protocol, and then everything that was built up around it in terms of, the transportation on top of it, the suburbs and retail and everything that sort of, grew up around the highway system, those were sort of the decentralized systems that provided all this value, pushing power to the edges. You have the centralized system that was created as the highway, and then allowed for decentralized systems to build up around it and generated all of this growth. And I began to think about this as an analogy for protocols. And so then, in terms of applying that back to the, this idea of protocols and decentralization, I realized that the protocol, if we think of the protocol as centralized, and this sort of took me a while, and in some ways feels obvious, almost too obvious to mention, but struck me as actually a really important point, was that the protocol is actually centralized. Because everybody associates, and myself in particular, I've always associated the protocols with decentralized systems. To think of the protocol as being centralized was sort of this important realization to me. But then everything else that's built on top of the protocol is decentralized. So then I started thinking about, like, okay, if we're sort of creating a framework, then the question is, which things belong in the centralized systems? Which things belong in the protocol, and which things should be pushed out towards the edges, and which things should be decentralized? So within the centralized protocol were things that are stable, right? So dealing with the too slow problem that Moxie talks about. Things that aren't changing, things that are mostly agreed upon, things that are your sort of core infrastructure, base level concepts that can be upgraded more slowly. The complaint that Moxie had, when the ecosystem is changing or the ecosystem is moving, the protocol is too slow to react and too slow to do anything. But if you have something that is solid that are sort of the basic building blocks of what you're trying to build, those things can go into the protocol. And then you think of it as a base to build on. I think too often many of the discussions I have with people about protocols is they think that the protocol is the whole system. The protocol has to build everything. And that is wrong, and that creates problems. The protocol is the foundation on which the decentralized system is built. The protocol is centralized, everything built on it is decentralized. And then finally, the value part is really, really important, that it has to enhance value, that it has to build up more. Tim O'Reilly had this concept that he's talked about a lot, of that successful internet systems create more value than they capture. And so I think that's an important part of it that I think gets lost in a lot of the discussion. And this is where you have a lot of the sort of build it and they will come. No, like you have to make sure that you're creating a system that allows the people, the decentralized part, the outside parts, to actually build something that actually increases value significantly. Then the decentralized parts, it's all about pushing the power to the edges and let them figure out how it works. Too many of the protocols that I hear about or that people talk about are really trying to develop everything, and it's almost as if they don't trust the edges. They're saying we're pushing power to the edges, but they don't provide enough trust. They don't they try and dictate too much, and the reality is I see from people developing some of these protocols is that they have a vision, and then when people start building on it and it doesn't match their vision, they get upset and worried about it and say you're kind of doing it wrong. So having trust in kind of what is going on at the edges is really, really important. And then the competition element is really important. Not the different nodes at the edges, not all of them are going to have the same vision, and you want competition, right? It creates these better incentive structures for innovation because it allows more people to test a variety of different things and see what works and see what actually gets people to use it, see what actually generates the value. And so, encouraging a level of competition at the decentralized edges of the network becomes really, really important. And so I'm almost finished up here, and then we'll get to a Q&A section. And so my thinking today is kind of, if we start thinking about things this way, where we have the centralized protocol and decentralized nodes, where there's the power goes to the edges and there's competition there, you kind of get the best of these systems where the protocol becomes the foundation, the core kind of infrastructure that allows people to build on top of it, and it just becomes this base that is really important. Whereas the decentralized nodes is where the really interesting stuff happens, where you have competition and innovation and the economic value being created, and you get you get systems where hopefully there's less of the downsides of each of these and more of the benefits of both of those. And in the paper that I wrote for Filecoin Foundation, I put in a few sort of provocative things at the end where whether or not this thinking can be applied more broadly. Most of my talking about it has been around social media and kind of the way that social media is structured today with very centralized silos, and the beginnings that we're seeing of a variety of experiments with more decentralized protocol-based systems. But this kind of thinking of a centralized protocol as the foundation and a decentralized system with nodes, I think could be really interesting to apply it in other areas. And so in the paper, I talk about 4 of them. Finance is an obvious one. There is obviously a lot of experimentation going on there as well. But also in the paper, I have a little bit on how it might work in healthcare and education, and potentially sort of rethinking how we think about both healthcare and education. And so there's really just a few paragraphs about each of those in the paper. I'm not going to necessarily go into either of them right here, but a lot of my thinking these days and sort of where I'm hoping to write some more is on those other areas. And can you apply this kind of thinking to other areas outside of directly internet systems that we normally talk about when we talk about protocols and decentralized systems. And so that's basically where I'm at. That's where that paper is currently at, and kind of where my thinking is. And so with that, I figured we could then go into the Q&A, and I can stop sharing if I can figure out how to do that and come back to here.
All right. Thanks, Mike. That was a very thought-provoking talk for us, especially since we just came back from a week-long retreat here in Seattle, where we all retreated to this really nice, quiet, secluded corner of the world and talked about protocols completely in isolation. And I think the interesting thing about what you're doing is you've been in the fray for 25 years. And these conversations always go one way when you're sort of like in a back room thinking about them in terms of abstractions, versus when you're in the fray watching how big, powerful tech leaders actually engage with the topics, what they actually do. So in the New York Times profile, there's a mention of a conversation with Zuck, and you also lately have been pretty candid about your views on the Elon Musk post-Twitter apocalyptic situation. So maybe I'll kick us off with a question about that. Like, can you kind of summarize your take on like what has happened with the Musk acquisition of Twitter and its aftermath? Because I think that's the best sort of live in the fray case study we have to think about.
Well, I mean, it is really interesting because one of the major discussions that I had in the years immediately following the Protocols Not Paper platform that came out was this question of how do you get the users, right? How do you switch from there's this kind of inertia of these giant centralized siloed systems have built up such a huge audience and have so many people. Switching to a decentralized system or a protocol-based system, seemed like an impossibility. There is this general sense that, like, whatever world you're in today is static. The idea that things are going to keep changing and evolving is sometimes very, very difficult to picture. And I get that. And I had seen, it's funny because, and I'm getting to answer your question. I know I'm taking a slightly roundabout way to get there. There was always this sort of big question of like, how do you actually get the users? And in my mind, originally there were two main paths to building up a system that would actually get users on a protocol-based decentralized system. One was that the big companies would figure out that it was actually better for them. And that's a lot of the Protocols Not Platforms paper was actually an attempt to try and convince the big platforms that it was a better system for them, and sort of appealing to their interests. The second was that somebody would just build a better system overall that just, made things much better. And as general, I love the term that Cory Doctorow came up with called enshittification. Like as these larger centralized platforms went through the inevitable process of enshittification, where they try and extract more value than they're creating, that the better system would come along and take over things. And I think both of those are valid ways of thinking about this. And then, soon after the paper came out, Jack Dorsey read it, and got really excited by it and announced the Blue Sky program for Twitter. And to me, that was very, very exciting because, that would, in theory, the idea being, if people don't know, what he announced was that he and Twitter would fund an independent team to build a protocol, with the idea being that Twitter would adopt it. And so if that played out the way that was expected, that was exciting because that would help bring the users. It was the first option of how do you get the users, which is, one of the large enough companies would recognize that it was important and sort of bring the users. And so I thought that was a really important step forward. And in fact, if you look at, when Elon announced he was taking over Twitter, and then there was the whole legal fight and text messages were released, and you see the text messages between Jack and Elon, there's, you see Jack telling Elon, pushing him to say like what it really needs, what Twitter really needs is, to open up, to be based on an open protocol, not to be sort of centrally controlled by one company, and a recognition, which I think was somewhat accurate, that like that's really, really difficult to do if you're a public company with Wall Street shareholders who have, quarterly interests. And this was always the issue that kept coming up while Jack was still in charge of Twitter, and he was trying to build the Blue Sky protocol on the side, but at the very same time, Wall Street and some board members of Twitter were really pushing him towards, you have to make more money, you have to extract more value from your users, otherwise Wall Street is going to punish you. And so, I think Jack sort of recognized it was really difficult to do that as a public company, and then he sort of saw the only solution to going private was to have somebody like an Elon come in and take it over, with the hopes that Elon would recognize the same value of decentralized protocols and push to adopt that without the pressure of Wall Street. Now, Elon seemed to have a totally different concept of what he wanted Twitter to be, and really, has moved, distantly far away from that, and if anything, has sort of, set up Twitter to be much more centralized control under his views and his views only, and really pushing away from this idea of pushing power to the edges. And so, I think we've moved far away from that, but in a weird way, that's also enabled more openness to thinking about protocols and decentralized systems almost by accident. And I forget where I wrote about this, but the very day that Elon announced that he was dropping the lawsuit to try and get out of the Twitter deal and that he was buying it, I was at a conference at Columbia University, again, who had sponsored the original Protocols Not Platforms paper, though this was a different group, and I was watching a presentation on stage from someone talking about like decentralized systems, and saying that they were inspired by my paper, which is always nice to hear, but I think it was one of those people who was really misunderstanding the paper. And they had this kind of amusing chart that showed like, centralized systems on one line, decentralized systems on the other, and they would cross, and then at some point they would, in terms of like usage, who was using it, would switch over. And there was like this big empty reason as to why they would switch. And it was sort of like the if you know the South Park underpants gnome meme, like, it's like, idea, steal underpants, question mark, question mark, question mark, profit. It was that kind of chart to me, whereas just like decentralized systems, users will come with a bunch of question marks in the middle. And, and I had asked a question of the speaker saying like, well, what is that, what is that catalyzing event that actually gets people to do this? And I think basically at that moment that I was asking that question, Elon was dropping the case to get out of the Twitter deal, and then a couple weeks later went through and purchased Twitter, and then has done a bunch of things that I think has renewed interest in decentralized systems, because people a lot of people certainly are upset with the direction that Twitter has gone. And so suddenly like a whole bunch of people flooded to Mastodon, a bunch of people then started using Nostr, which is a very decentralized system as well. And then now Blue Sky, which again was originally supposed to just be this protocol other than Twitter, and then others could adopt, has built their own reference app, and then that has gotten a bunch of attention. And so suddenly we're getting all of this attention for decentralized systems, in part because Elon has so messed up the centralized system that he now controls, that could have become the decentralized system. Does that it was a long way around, but
No, that was a very useful sort of front row seat version of the story. I think we've all watched from different perspectives, and that was really useful. I think I saw a bunch of hands up, so please raise your hands again if you lowered them. I think I saw Steve, Timber, Fevin, and Dorian. So let's go in that order if you still have your questions. So let's start with Steve.
I didn't actually raise my hand.
Oh, all right. Who had their hand raised and still has the question? Dorian, take it away.
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Mike. I'm curious. So I'm about 5 years younger than you, so I remember the dial-up days.
Yeah.
And I remember when people calling tech support would think that the IE was the internet, like they understand that there was like websites you had to go, like they were getting something from somewhere else, and that the E logo was responsible for everything. So a misattribution of like what belongs to. And I mean, I had a similar experience just a few years ago. Similar thing, like otherwise a normal educated person did not understand that a mobile website was a mobile website and not a app. They call it that. And so I guess my concern is that like the median user is still hopelessly, irretrievably, unworkably ignorant, and like they just don't care. They're not interested in the distinction between platforms. Yes. And so I just would like you to riff on that for a second.
Yeah, no, it is a really important point, and I originally I even had a slide about that in the presentation. I sort of pulled it out because I didn't quite know where to fit it. But yes, I think that's right. I think you're exactly right, and that is important. That's also why like focusing on decentralization as like the key attribute, I think is wrong and a mistake because of that. Because the average person doesn't care. The average person, it makes no difference to them. So what I think the real value is that the decentralized nodes on this system need to be designed as if all of that stuff doesn't matter to the end user. And I know that like the developers on Blue Sky have been pretty explicit about this, that they recognize what it is that they're trying to build with the AT protocol and their system, but they don't think that the average user should care about that. They want the average user just to be using any of the, in their case, federated setups at the end of the network, and everything should just work. They don't, the one of the problems with Mastodon is you sort of conceptually have to understand the federated nature of it to make it work properly, and that's where people just get really annoyed and upset. The Blue Sky approach, in theory, we haven't seen it in practice yet, but in theory is designed to be for exactly that, where it's not going to be like, sign up for the AT protocol, or it will be pick a service, find a service, and you don't even have to know that it's connected. You just need to know that you can communicate with whoever you want. And again, to some extent, like I go back to the example, and it's not a perfect analogy, but it is a useful one, of like the email structure, where email is based on various protocols, and we have different players who offer front ends, and people who use email don't have to worry about that it's decentralized. And lots of people default to Gmail just because it's a nice, easy user interface, and you have the issue of like that people don't think about, but they can email anyone who is not on Gmail as well.
The caveat with that, though, is if you're trying to send email, like if you're trying to like send it automatically somehow, like if you got an auto responder or something like that, or something from your website, like you need an intermediary now, because you've got 4 or 5 big email providers, including stuff, whatever. They won't let you send to them.
Right.
You do it through like Mailgun or something like that.
Right.
So the protocol's been captured by an oligopoly at this point.
Yes. Yeah, that is absolutely true. And I say that as someone who literally had that problem where like for the first 3 or 4 months of this year, like half of my emails were disappearing because Gmail was just eating them, sending no, there were all sorts of problems, and including very important emails just completely disappeared into the ether, or I would send them and have no idea that they weren't being delivered. And so absolutely true. absolutely a potential issue, but a separate one that can be dealt with in separate ways. The idea is still, if the systems that the end users are interacting with are good, well designed, easy to understand, easy to use systems, and it's just on the back end that it's decentralized based on a protocol, federated, whatever the setup might be. You deal with that. Let the questions of decentralization and how the system works, that shouldn't be the end user's concern. It should be the people building the system's concern.
Right, Shuya.
Hello, hello. I'll let Rafa go first in the question queue if you wanted to.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Shreya. I had two questions. So the first one is, do you actually have like a definition of protocols that you adhere to? And within that definition, do you see a difference in terms of how organizations actually form, like the shape of the organizations, in contrast to organizations built on platforms? Or do we think they're the same types of organizations?
That's two really good questions. I think my definition of protocols is I think I had a sort of more hard and fast one early on, and I've sort of moved away from that as I've seen just all these sort of different attempts at it. And some of them were different and sort of wouldn't have matched my original definition, but were still really interesting and enabling some really interesting things. So I now have sort of moved away from anything like that and have a little bit more fuzzy definition. I mean, to me, it really just becomes that core framework, that base on which everything else is built. So, which centralized, core infrastructure do you want to standardize around? And then everything else becomes the systems on top of it. So I don't have one specifically. In terms of like corporate structure, again, we're seeing so many different experiments that start to play out now that it's kind of interesting to see. And so again, my thinking is kind of in flux on that. Because we're seeing different experiments and it's kind of interesting. Like, for example, Blue Sky, is set up as a public benefit corporation. So has, a profit incentive, but also can work towards a public benefit mission. There are obviously lots of nonprofits, and then you have, obviously with protocols, there are a bunch of things that are set up as like DAOs or other unique structures. I'm not entirely sure kind of what works the best, and I think we're seeing different experiments happen. So I don't have like a good clear answer of like what is the best way to structure it. Because we're seeing a bunch of different things play out, and they're all sort of interesting to me, but I don't have a strong feeling one way or the other right now.
Thanks, Mike. I'll jump in because this question is a little bit related to Rafa's question on structuring organizations, a little bit more exploratory than like, what is the answer? But if you're familiar with the zine of Exit to Community from Nathan Schneider and the folks at Boulder, I'm actually super curious in the way that created a bit of a new path and added like a third option for the IPO and the acquisition for a lot of ventures. What is the general sentiment, or is there a conversation around what exit to protocol might look like? Twitter being an example, but instead of exiting to a public B Corp, what does it look like to start thinking about like venture runway is used to test out and work out like what is the most effective protocol and use the funding to pull towards that, and then to get ready for going protocol in the same way that one would celebrate going public and potentially have some of those returns. But general thoughts.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I mean, the whole like exit to community thing, there is actually in that Filecoin Foundation magazine that, again, in theory, I think is coming out this week. There is an article that talks about the whole exit to community concept as one of the things in there. And I think, I think it is really fascinating, but I don't know, like, how that actually works in practice. I think I'm sort of excited and somewhat inspired by the fact that people are thinking about these things and sort of saying, like, it does, we don't have to do like an IPO structure, or what is the end goal in terms of like getting to launching, or however you want to describe it, getting to that next stage where the control of the system is to a community or to a protocol, or to a DAO, or whatever the structure is. I think it's sort of an exciting period of time in that we're seeing these different structures and going beyond what the traditional ones are. But I don't have a good sense of what is actually going to be the best way to handle it. One thing, this is not quite getting to your question, but I think is interesting, and is something I've been thinking a lot about in the last month or so, was a comment that was made by one of Blue Sky's engineers, was that they were developing Blue Sky with the thinking that their own company, Blue Sky, is a future adversary. And that struck me as really interesting and very different than, like, every other company pretty much. Everybody sort of is trying to build up their own power and their own value, and that's where you get the sort of enshittification curve of like trying to extract more value from your users or your partners. And Blue Sky, at least today, has this stated value. It's a question of whether or not it will actually go into existence, or become reality. Is they're setting themselves up, they recognize that their own future company is this future adversary. And so approaches like that, exit to community, exit to protocol, whatever it might be, appear to be attempts to sort of lock in that idea of the company itself that is developing this is a potential adversary, and we need to build for that and protect against that. Again, it's really early, but to me, it's pretty fascinating to see those discussions occurring, and having people recognize that and trying to build towards that kind of recognition.
All right, and with that, we're just about at time. Thanks a lot, Mike. I think you connected a lot of dots for us. We just had Jay Graber join us for dinner during our retreat. So that nice. Conversation is fresh for some of us. And we had Evan Miyazono from Protocol Labs give a talk last month. So that conversation is also fresh. So we're, I think, all going to be looking forward to your Filecoin magazine, since we're also currently talking about how to publish our own output. So thanks for joining us. And our next talk is tomorrow. Brian Johnson will be talking about his Blueprint Health Protocol. So I think with that, if you have further questions, Mike's on the Discord, and we have an active conversation going there, so we can take the conversation there. Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Thank you.